So away you go.
All right. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. My assignment for this morning was to try to explain the seemingly inexplicable. How it was that hundreds, maybe thousands of Indiana Quakers joined the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. So let me say, before I get into the details of that, I'm used to being in a classroom, so if you have questions, comments, impassioned rebuttal, feel free to wave at me and we will take it from there. So, what I want to try to do this morning is to explain, first of all, why it is that the Klan was so powerful in Indiana in the 1920s. Indeed, historians agree the Klan probably had more power in Indiana between roughly 1921 and 1925 than it did in any other state in the Union, and that includes Texas or Mississippi or Alabama. The Indiana Klan was part of a national movement that was a significant force in both the Democratic and the Republican parties in the first half of the 1920s. This has come to the attention of a lot of folks I know because of a book that came out last year. Some of you may have seen Timothy Egan's A Fever in the Heartland, which is generally well documented, generally well argued, certainly quite engaging. For a lot of people, it's a shocking expose of what was happening here in Hoosier land in the 20s. For people like myself who know some Indiana history, there wasn't anything especially new or surprising in here. If you want a shorter version that's more analytical, more focused on trying to explain why it was that the Klan became so powerful here in Indiana in the 1920s, I'd recommend this book, The Ku Klux Klan in the Heartland, by James H. Madison, who's a retired historian at Indiana University. So, what I'll be doing this morning, first, explain generally why the Klan becomes so popular and powerful here in Indiana. Then try to make sense of why Quakers would be attracted to it. Look particularly at one Quaker minister, Daisy Douglas Barr, who actually becomes the head of the National Klan Women's Auxiliary in the 1920s. And then conclude by looking at some Indiana Quakers who were opposed to the Klan, the heroes of our story, in retrospect. Okay, the Ku Klux Klan, of course, first appeared in the South in the years immediately following the Civil War. And it was basically a white terrorist organization masquerading as a fraternal society like the Masons or the Odd Fellows. Its goal was to maintain white supremacy in the South after the Civil War had abolished slavery, in particular to make sure that the freed Black people did not become economic or political threats. Ultimately, by the early 1870s, the use of the army in the South had pretty much destroyed the Klan as an organization, but of course, white supremacists found other ways to assert their power and were pretty much in control by the 1880s. And not every target of the Klan in the South was Black. White Republicans, especially in Virginia and North Carolina, found themselves the targets of Klan violence. My wife, Mary Louise, had a great-great-grand-uncle named Tetman Schaffner, who was a North Carolina state senator. He sponsored an anti-Klan law in the legislature the Klan responded with such violence that he just gave up and moved to Hendricks County. He died and is buried in Danville. So in short, there is a long history behind the Klan. The Klan came to new attention in 1950 with the release of what was then the most popular movie ever done in the United States. D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which presented Klansmen as the heroes, the saviors, especially of white womanhood in the South in the 1860s. And that led to a refounding of the Klan beginning in Georgia. This time, its emphasis was not just on white supremacy, although that was central to it, but the Klan emphasized a number of other aspects of what it saw as true Americanism: being native born, being Protestant, being descended from Northern European immigrants, being wholeheartedly committed to traditional morality. After World War I, the Klan exploded as a national movement, and in particular proved to be very popular here in Indiana. Estimates are that somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million men in Indiana between 1920 and 1925 paid the $10 to become members in good standing of the Klan. There were also Klan women's auxiliaries and even junior clans for the children of people who were attracted to this organization. Well, how do you explain this? There are several things operating here. The Klan proved popular in Indiana because it spoke to a lot of long-standing anxieties that were being exacerbated by social and economic change in the 1920s. Certainly, the Klan was a racist, white supremacist organization. But as a friend of mine, another historian named Leonard Moore, pointed out in a book that he wrote about the Klan in Indiana 30 years ago, called Citizen Klansman, it's wrong to think that in Indiana in the 1920s, the racists joined the Ku Klux Klan, and the non-Klan members were therefore anti-racist. Almost every white person in Indiana in the 1920s shared in the general racism of American society to some extent. Certainly, some were much more forward about it. But for white people in Indiana in the 1920s, for the overwhelming majority, things like racial segregation, a horror at the idea of interracial marriage, residential segregations, those were things that were just taken for granted. And remember, at the 1920s, you have an accelerating great migration of Black people out of the South. And they are particularly heading for cities like Evansville or Indianapolis or Fort Wayne or the region, Gary, East Chicago, Hammond. That explains why these cities especially become centers of Klan activity. One person who's looked at Klan membership patterns in the city of Indianapolis has found that Klan membership tended to be highest in neighborhoods that adjoined Black neighborhoods. So if you're worried about your property being devalued by Black neighbors moving in, that probably explains why you're going to be attracted to the Klan. But the Klan draws on other strains in white Hoosier anxiety in the 1920s. Certainly, you would have found a lot of native-born Protestants in Indiana in the 1920s who were fearful of immigration. Remember that between 1900 and 1914, you had seen a climax of European immigration into the United States, mainly immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, from Poland, from the Balkans, from Italy. And these are areas that had not sent many immigrants to the United States before. These are new immigrants. For the first time, you also get waves of Jewish immigration coming out of Eastern Europe. And again, this leads to an explosion of the Jewish population in the United States. These immigrants coming in, if they are not Jewish, are almost always Roman Catholic. Anti-Semitism has always been around in the larger American society, but as Jewish populations grow, so does anti-Semitism. And of course, anti-Catholicism, or what was referred to at the time as anti-popery, goes back to the beginnings of British settlement in what would become the United States. So as Catholics grow in number and become more prominent, begin to exert political power, that makes some people anxious. There is also a lot of worry about the social changes you're seeing in Indiana and throughout the United States in the 1920s. This is, after all, the period we call the Roaring Twenties. In colleges and universities, even within Protestant churches, there are challenges to old orthodoxies. You have even ministers questioning whether all of the Bible should be understood literally, whether some parts of the Bible might be mythological or metaphorical. For some people, that's simply progress and advance of knowledge, but for a lot of Protestants in Indiana, that is a threat to the foundations of their faith, and it needs to be combated. A lot of these anxieties have to do with sex. This is the period when movie attendance skyrockets in the United States, and it's also the period before there is a production code in Hollywood. So certainly 1920s movies are pretty restrained by contemporary standards, but if you look at some of the advertising, you have, for example, Clara Bow, the it girl, and everybody understands what it is with her. You have Theda Vera, who is a vamp, a female vampire preying on vulnerable men. You have home wreckers. You have jazz babies. I remember reading one movie advertisement in the Indianapolis Star from 1922 that tells about petting parties in the purple dawn, all building to a tremendous climax that will leave you gasping. Again, people understand what's being implied here. Add to that the impact of automobiles. My great aunt, who was a teenager in Newcastle in the 1920s, remembered that one of the things that the Ku Klux Klan did around Newcastle was to drive around the country roads at night, looking for parked cars and young couples, and if they found them, they would shine a flashlight on them and order them to go home. That was not popular with the young couples, but it was popular with a lot of parents who are worried about these things. Give you another example. 1922, there was a great debate going on in Richmond whether dances should be officially sponsored at the Richmond High School. For lots of Protestants in Indiana in the 1920s, dancing is morally suspect. And when the Richmond School Board decided to vote against allowing dancing, the Richmond Palladium gave most of the credit to members of the West Richmond Friends meeting, who had led the movement to keep dancing out of the high school. Uh, Finally, and I think this is probably more important than anything else in explaining why the Klan appeals to so many people in Indiana in the 1920s. Prohibition. Remember, the 18th Amendment has gone into effect in the United States at the beginning of 1920. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages is illegal in the United States. For many, many Protestants, including just about all Quakers in Indiana, the 18th Amendment was the culmination of a great reform movement that they had advocated since the 1840s or 1850s. It was an article of faith among many, many church people in Indiana that alcohol was the source, maybe not of all evils, but of most of the social evils that plagued American society. And the Klan billed itself as vigilantes, as the shock troops working with legal authorities to banish demon rum from the state of Indiana. And these kinds of attitudes held on for a long time. I'm sure a lot of you are probably in a situation similar to me. I was born in 1957. I was 11 years old growing up in Newcastle, Indiana, before I ever saw a person take a drink of alcohol. And when I did, I was convinced lightning was going to strike. In the world where I grew up, that was just not something that good people did. You know, beer drinkers were bad people over there. Anything beyond that was just unimaginable. So the Klan, through its support of prohibition, its willingness to confront lawbreakers, to report on people who are selling alcohol illegally, in some cases to go in with axes and break up speakeasies and illegal saloons. Once again, this confirms the impression that the Klan is made up of good Christians who are fighting for traditional morality, who are fighting against evil. And the result is that by 1924, the Indiana Klan, led by a man named D.C. Stevenson, has pretty much taken over the Indiana Republican Party. And since Republicans were the majority party in Indiana at that time, that meant they were in control of the state. In 1924, a Klan member, Ed Jackson, from Newcastle, is elected governor, and it is widely believed that the Klan is pretty much in control of both houses of the legislature. That's November 1924. By the end of 1925, Klan power in Indiana is in sharp decline. And that's partly because of continuing resistance, but largely because of the misdeeds of D.C. Stevenson. Stevenson was relatively young. He was born in 1891 in Texas. He'd only come to Indiana in 1920. He left a trail of scandal behind him: bankruptcy, bad debts, bigamy, deserted wife and child back in Oklahoma. He's probably something of an alcoholic and certainly a serial sexual abuser, but he sees potential as a salesman in the Klan, and by 1924, he's made himself the head of it in Indiana, even though his personal lifestyle is the antithesis of what Klansmen are supposed to be. His power comes to an end in November 1925 when he is convicted of murder in a trial held up in Noblesville in Hamilton County. One of the prosecutors on the state case was Justin Roberts, the father of Joe Roberts, grandfather of Tom Roberts, whom some of you may know. And in fact, this was a landmark case. Stevenson had maybe kidnapped, maybe bullied a young woman from Irvington named Madge Oberholzer into taking a train trip with him. On the trip, he forced her to drink alcohol, then raped her, She was so traumatized by this that she poisoned herself, attempted to commit suicide. Stevenson went into a panic, brought her back to her parents' house in Irvington, and dumped her there, saying that there'd been some sort of misunderstanding. Oberholzer, however, lived almost a month after she swallowed the poison and was able to dictate a number of statements to attorneys and to the Marion County prosecutor about what had happened. The Marion County prosecutor has no love for for Stevenson or the Klan, so he brings charges of murder against Stevenson. And this is a new legal theory. Nobody is questioning that Madge Oberholzer voluntarily swallowed that poison. But the prosecutor is arguing that Stevenson's actions drove her to it, and he is therefore guilty of murder. And the Hamilton County jury agreed. He was convicted of second-degree murder. His friends in the State House looked the other way since he had become such an embarrassment to the Indiana Klan, and he went off to the Indiana State Penitentiary to stay there until the 1950s. This tale of corruption and criminality sent the Klan into a tailspin from which it never recovered. Okay, why is it that Quakers would have been attracted to an organization like this? And there's no question that a lot of Quakers joined. Wayne County, Richmond, where I'm from, is one of the few counties in the state of Indiana for which we have the actual Klan membership lists, the names of all of the men who paid the $10 to become members. And there are a lot of Quaker names on there. The historian I mentioned earlier, Leonard Moore, estimates that probably between a quarter and a third of all of the Quaker men in Wayne County were members of the Klan at one time or another. We know of at least 3 Quaker ministers from Indiana, pastors who became Klan members. One of them was the pastor at Wabash Friends, Ira Dawes. He was praised in the American Friend in 1921. Wabash Friends meeting was growing under his leadership. He'd been elected the president of the school board. He was the head of the local Red Cross. He was the president of the Ministerial Association, a member of the County Board of Charities, the president of the local Kiwanis Club. One of his church members just wrote a poem about him. With optimistic, earnest zeal, he labors for the common weal, and every noble, righteous cause has strong support from Ira Dawes. Yet he's also a Klan leader. The best known, however, was a woman, Daisy Douglas Barr. She was born into a Methodist family up near Fairmount in 1873, married when she was 20 years old, felt a call to preach, and since Quakers, who were numerous around Fairmount and Grant County, were more open to women ministers than Methodists were, she became a Quaker and very quickly built a successful career as a Quaker pastor. She moved steadily up from small places like Louisville, then to Greenfield, then she got a major appointment as the pastor of Friends Memorial Church in Muncie, moved from there to Mooresville when her husband got a job in Indianapolis. Then in 1921 was called to be pastor of First Friends in Newcastle, and by all accounts was quite successful there. At one monthly meeting in April 1922, Newcastle Friends took in 160 new members. Since I'd been interested in history for a long time, in the 1970s and 1980s, I was able to talk to people who remembered Daisy. One man told me that his mother never liked Daisy because she thought that she was a terrible flirt. The men always liked her more than women did. But everybody agreed she was a wonderful preacher, wonderful pulpit orator. After only a year, however, she left Newcastle Friends. In fact, she was told to leave. Her contract was not renewed because she had joined the Ku Klux Klan. So instead, she left Quaker ministry behind to become the head of the National Klan Women's Auxiliary in the United States. And if you look at newspaper accounts of her speeches, there's no doubt that she has swallowed the whole Klan Kool-Aid. She warns against the dangers of immigrants, of Jews, of Catholics, of Black people. She is 100% behind prohibition, and she emphasizes how liquor dealers and Jews are often white slavers. So the best way to preserve unsullied, virginal, white womanhood is through supporting the Klan. There's no question that a lot of this message, especially support for prohibition, resonated with Indiana Quakers. They're still mostly rural. They're traditional in their morality. A lot of them are worried about the social changes that they see in the larger American society. One of Ira Dawes's accomplishments that is widely praised by Indiana Quakers was that he persuaded the Wabash City Council to pass a local ordinance closing movie theaters on Sunday. Instead of going to movies on Sunday night, young people would go to church services instead. So there's a lot here that apparently appeals to Quakers. We know also that at least 2 Earlham students became members of the Klan between 1921 and 1925. One was named Osborne, the other named Mendenhall. Long Quaker genealogies behind them. There's also a sequel to this story that I like to tell my students about. One of these Earlham students who joined the Klan was Burke Mendenhall. He was the son of a Quaker pastor who had served in Indiana and North Carolina and Ohio. After Earlham, Burke Mendenhall went on to do graduate work. He ends up a professor of education at Ohio State University. In 1945, Burke Mendenhall was elected by the alumni to be a trustee of Earlham College. And in 1945, there was a big debate going on among the Earlham administration and board of trustees about whether the college should have a policy to discourage interracial dating. Earlham was integrated, and with the shortage of men during World War II, there were some female students who had actually shown themselves open to dating men of different races, or at least going to a dance with them. This worried the president of Earlham, William C. Dennis, who argued that interracial relationships weren't bad in themselves, but that generally college students were too immature to understand the prejudice they would face in the larger society. So the college should discourage things like this. The one trustee who outright opposed this policy, denounced it as unvarnished bigotry, was Burke Mendenhall, the former Klan member. So as I tell people, redemption is possible. People can change, and this is an obvious example of it. I think it's also important to keep in mind, and here I'm not trying to excuse, I'm trying to explain, that the Indiana Klan in the 1920s was different from the Southern version. Certainly it tried to be intimidating. No question that it's anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, it is thoroughly racist and white supremacist, but it doesn't lynch anybody. It may have burned one church in southern Indiana, but that's the only case where that claim was ever made. And in fact, there probably was, in some cases, incidents in which it was perversely progressive. Again, Richmond, 1923. A group of local businessmen are trying to persuade the city council to sell the city's municipally owned electrical plant to this group of businessmen, to privatize it, in other words. It's the Klan that leads the opposition to this, saying that the businessmen only want to get a monopoly on supplying electricity to the city so they can gouge consumers. That's progressive by any standard. And there's also no question that some people were probably coerced into joining the Klan, who felt social pressure. In a lot of cities, Klansmen will only buy from other Klansmen, and they have ways of signaling who belongs and who doesn't. Here I'll tell a little bit of family history. 1922, my great-grandfather, James B. Hamm, was a dairy farmer outside of Newcastle. He sold his milk, making daily deliveries to groceries and restaurants in Newcastle. Many of his customers, probably a majority of them, had joined the Klan, and they pressured him to join. He refused. He lost that business, and it was such a financial hit that my great-uncle had to quit school and go to work to help support the family. There were probably a lot of people who couldn't resist pressure like that. Now, here we get to the happy part of the story, because certainly there were some Indiana friends in the 1920s who were open in denouncing the Ku Klux Klan. The person who, as near as I can tell, reconstructing what happened 60 years later, the weighty friend in Newcastle who forced out Daisy Douglas Barr, was an attorney, former congressman named William O. Barnard, very active in Indiana Yearly Meeting. And in 1924, he wrote a letter to the American Friends saying that the Klan's minions had captured the Hoosier GOP and made it a weak and lowly pack animal for the powers of darkness. 1922 Indiana Yearly Meeting actually passed a minute condemning the Klan. It is important at this time for friends to recognize that the Ku Klux Klan is a secret and oath-bound order. As a church, we want to be fair in our utterance and relations toward all organizations. But we believe the Ku Klux Klan, by hiding behind a mask, is un-American, by its antagonism to a church is unchristian, and by its fostering and fomenting race hatred is unpatriotic. Therefore, we would advise our members not to join it or to assist it in any way. Or an editorial in the Weekly American Friend by its editor, the head of the 5 years meeting of Friends in America, and the president of the Earlham Board of Trustees, Walter C. Woodward, writing about the Klan. His editorial was entitled, "The Shame of Indiana." Whatever may be the national ills to which this night writing order addresses itself, and whatever the scattering instances of good accomplishment here and there, the whole spirit and basis of the movement are thoroughly pernicious. It is essentially divisive and anarchic. It breeds suspicion and flouts the very law it pretends to uphold. It thrives in soil so deep in hate. A distemper of the mind and a perversion of the heart must be created for the free flowering of this noxious, night-blooming cereus. If Indiana Friends did their duty, the Klan would be weak. What we need today is to drain the atmosphere of the malaria of prejudice and the miasma of hate that infect our minds and hearts. So what do we make of all of this? Well, first of all, I think there's no question that the only way that the Klan could have had such appeal to Indiana Quakers in the 1920s is because Indiana Quakers had become largely acculturated. You would find some exceptions, but for the most part, the Friends Church isn't that different in most places in Indiana from the Baptists or Methodists or Presbyterians or Disciples of Christ down the street. The same other Protestants who were joining the Klan. Joining the Klan also shows that Indiana Quakers, at least those who joined the Klan, aren't especially resistant to anti-Catholicism or anti-Semitism. A New York friend named Hollingsworth Wood told a Quaker audience in 1924 the Quakers had certainly been major stockholders and shareholders in the Underground Railroad before the Civil War, but that, as he put it, Friends inherited the stock of the Underground Railroad, but we long ago stopped paying any dividends on it. You can argue in some ways that the 1920s are probably the nadir of American Quaker commitment to racial justice. But you also see a lot of Indiana Quakers in the 1920s who are doing the right thing. The majority who don't join the Klan. The people like William O. Barnard and Walter C. Woodward who speak up publicly against it, probably at some risk to themselves. People like Justin Roberts, who, when he joins in the prosecution team against D.C. Stevenson in the fall of 1924, is by no means doing something that's going to advance his political career. It's only in retrospect that that turns out to be a good thing. Or people like my great-grandfather Hamm, who I vaguely remember. He died when I was 7 years old. Somebody who never got his name in the newspaper very often. Somebody who only had a fourth grade education, but when he had to make a moral choice, made the moral choice. I'm tempted to draw parallels between things I see happening in contemporary American society in the 2020s and what was going on in Indiana in the 1920s, but I'll leave those to you to decide whether that would be an accurate and valid and fair comparison or not. Instead, I'll just say I'm done. We'll be happy to entertain questions, comments, impassioned rebuttals.
We'll tell you that the Birth of a Nation, when Griffin did his film, it was, the Hollywood of the time was a neighborhood in Chicago, and the, quote, Southern Mansion actually faces Lake Michigan in very liberal Evanston, and so it's rather funky that they would deny that it ever happened, but you'll get a historian where Scott and I lived, and we could walk to that particular venue, and there's no sign that they would ever say that.
Wasn't that the first movie showing the White House?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know.
President Wilson, right?
President Wilson.
Yeah. Well, supposedly Wilkinson said that it was history written with lightning, although there's no contemporary account of that. That doesn't show up in print until the 1960s. Back there. Yes.
Is it early?
No, it's at the Indiana Historical Society. And when it was found in the late 1970s, the donor put a restriction on it that no names could be published until the year 2000, but now it's completely open. And we have also found the membership lists from Hamilton County that are now at the Indiana Historical Society. Yes?
I've seen the list of the members from Morgan County.
Oh,
At one point, I had the book. I don't know what the heck happened to it.
oh my goodness.
But that, I do know it existed. And I found my great-grandfather there, unfortunately. But I was curious about something else in your studies. The time frame's not quite the same, but especially Daisy kind of comes to mind. Was there, and I know we have this, the suffrage movement which preceded probably that, was there any connection between the women involved in the suffrage movement and, I guess you'd say, the enthusiasm that they had for reform that might have gone into their support for the Klan?
Unfortunately, there is, because when you look at arguments for women's suffrage, particularly in states like Indiana, it is linked directly with prohibition. If women get the vote, they will vote to close the saloons. And that explains why ethnic groups and the Democratic Party, which are opposed to prohibition, also oppose women's suffrage. So, as I used to tell my students, good and evil are seldom pure. Yeah, I mean, some of the people who want votes for women want women voting so they can do things that the Klan thinks are right.
This is not to excuse the, like, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, anti-black sentiment of the time, but I might have been tempted to share their fears, because if you love the principles of the United States, that it was founded on, and for the most part, most of history, it's been dominated by white Protestant males, you might fear that letting other people in would change it.
Yeah, there's no question that that's what motivates a lot of people.
But today, we know, like, I don't think anybody would today be afraid of Irish immigrants, or Italians, or Portuguese, or, because we know that they have come in great numbers and have not changed the essential structure and principles of the United States. So, sadly, I don't know what would have done. I might have been afraid that people with differing backgrounds, different beliefs, different values might threaten something I hold dear. And I'm not sure that I would have been the brave one that said, no, this is wrong.
Yeah.
I was born in 42 in Louisiana. And the culture was the Klan. And it was referred to as it's in the water. It was that pervasive. All the, colored only.
How about your relatives? Do you have remember specific?
I have some people that my husband and I both went to high school, different high school. Mine in Baton Rouge, she was in North Louisiana, who stayed in their hometowns, especially in the smaller ones, who have not changed at all.
Oh, I'm
That's
sure.
why we did not retire in Louisiana. You have to take a step back of about 100 years to fit in a lot of those communities. No, that's wrong.
Yes.
In a lot of, we've all seen it, it's television and movie things, the depiction of the burning cross placed in an enemy's yard as a warning of trouble ahead. And I read an article saying that was a Hollywood creation and not, the Klan didn't often do that. Is that a correct thing?
I don't think so. I mean,
They did do that?
they did do that. I think that the cross burnings became much more prominent in Klan activities with the second Klan that starts, in the 19-teens. Although usually, as near as I can tell, cross burnings were part of Klan ceremonies where, they'd all be gathered in a field somewhere and they climax it by burning a cross. In Richmond, there was only one case of the Klan burning a cross on private property. And ironically, that was at the home of a white lawyer named Henry U. Johnson, because he had sponsored the admission to the Wayne County Bar of C.R. Richardson, who was the first black attorney in Richmond. And so the Klan was more upset with Johnson for being a race traitor than it was targeting Richardson.
And
And
when they were out patrolling at night, like catching kids
mhm.
in parked cars, do they always wear their hoods?
I don't know. That's a good
Did they
question.
always wear the robes?
Or was that more for, hey, it's a special day?
Yeah.
Those guys, I'm sorry, to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
The grandfather was telling me about, I also, I had his badge at one time, I don't know where it is, but they were the Horse Thief Detective Association.
Oh, yes.
Which was basically the strong arm of the Klan.
Right.
And they didn't wear hoods, they just went out and raised ruckuses with people that they didn't think were doing the right thing, in their opinion.
Yeah, there was an Indiana law dating to the 1850s that gave people the right to organize horse thief detective associations and basically become legalized vigilantes. And over at Earlham, we have the printed constitution for the Decatur Township Horse Thief Detective Association. And there were quite a few Quakers who were members of it.
What is the message of burning a cross? Other than,
Well, as Klansmen see it, it is the cross lighting up the place. That the flaming cross strikes fear into the hearts of Christ's enemies and illuminates the world. So, it's certainly not anti-Christian in their minds to burn a cross in the way that burning a flag would be. Back there.
In Egan's book, I found it interesting that the Klan built alliances with churches and pastors, in a sense, by giving them a cut. They actually recruited in churches. Pastors allowed them to set up a table in the entryway or whatever, so that you could sign up to become a member of the Klan. And when you paid your dues, a piece of those dues went to that church. So they were building alliances with other organizations, and that helped to spread their influence as well.
Right, and very often robed Klansmen would appear in Sunday morning church services at churches whose pastors they liked and, would very conspicuously hand him $25 or something like that.
My parents grew up in Hamm, Illinois, in Williamson County, which became known as Bloody Williamson. So in the 20s, the bootleggers, two different gangs, but then a guy showed up and went to the churches first, saying he was there to fight prohibition. And it didn't become apparent until several months down the road that he was actually Klan. So a lot of those people got sucked in, through the churches initially because of the prohibition piece. But by the end of it, most of the big churches kind of kicked him out. But it was a mess because in those pastors, they had the bootleggers and the Klan after them. So I'm sure you're familiar with that history across the border.
Yes. I guess we've got time for maybe one more
Yeah,
question.
Scott's got one up.
Yeah, I read a little bit about the Klan too. And interesting, in the Indiana Klan at least, they did not wear face masks, so you knew who they were. They were in Klan regalia. And that many.
I don't think that's right.
That's what I read. And
Okay.
also that, I believe it was in the Stevenson book there, the book underneath that.
Yeah, but
Yes, that they're, look in the Klan, they have pictures of Klan marches.
Yeah.
And the Klan did not always wear masks. Maybe they did
Well,
that at some
maybe they
time.
didn't always wear masks.
And that there was a $4 commission, that's why Stevenson liked it, out of the 10.
Made him a
So that's
millionaire.
probably why the churches got, some part of the cut of that action.
I think one last question, then I think we'll need to move on.
I think it's Debbie.
yeah, my grandparents were Danville friends, and 20 years old in the 1920s. My dad was born in 22, and I just always wondered what their opinion was, or what the Danville friends thought of it, and I went to the library not too long ago in Danville, to look at the old minutes stuff. There was no mention, one way or the other, of it that I found. I wasn't there very long.
Well, if you want the Klan point of view, they published a newspaper in Indianapolis, the Fiery Cross, that had reports from around the state. So you could look through that. There are copies of the State Library and the Indiana Historical Society.
My grandma never said anything at all related to that, but she was the most unprejudiced person I've ever.
Well, understandably, it's not something a lot of people wanted to talk about afterwards.
Thank you ever so much. Again, if you want to, Hamm will be at Sugar Road on Hadley at about 3 o'clock.
Telling a happier story.
Telling a happy story. Good.